Hello everybody. In this video I just want to talk through the basics of using Photoshop to create a title in Premiere Pro. So we'll start with Photoshop. So here is the title that I've created. It's a very simple lower third. It's just a few boxes with some text on top. So there's the white box here, there's the yellow box here, and on and off, and then there are two lines of text, the line for the top and the line for the bottom. Now at this point I don't want to go through the basics of using Photoshop, like the text tools and things like that. That's for another time. But it is worth pointing out a few things and talking briefly through how you set up a file if you're starting in Photoshop. So the first thing you'll notice is this checkable background here. If you're not familiar with Photoshop, this essentially means there's no background. It essentially means that this will be see-through, and we'll see what that means in practice when we move over to Premiere Pro. But if I was going to create a graphic from scratch, all I would do is go to File and New, and this is where this version of Photoshop, which is Creative Suite 2017, and a few earlier are really handy in that they have presets for film and video. So I don't need to worry about the right resolution and the right shapes and sizes. They've got plenty of options for me to work with. And the one I'm looking for, at least for working with your projects, is HDTV 1080p. Which is 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels. So that's your standard high definition TV signal, and it will work well with footage that you shoot on your phones as well. A couple of things to check before we go is that the width and the height is right. We can leave everything else, and then it's this option here that's worth a look. So by default it will appear with a white background, and if you want a graphic that fills the whole screen, then a coloured background, regardless of whether you start with white or a different colour, and you can change the colour here, is where you want to go. You can also default to a black, some other black background colour, but if we're doing titles that overlay on the video so we can see the title and the video at the same time, then it's best to start with transparent. And then if I click Create, you can see a new file is opened with that checkerboard pattern, which means it's see-through, and then these blue guides here. And these blue guides here are Action Safe and our Title Safe guides. So it's good practice to make sure that all of the readable or all of the important parts of our titles, essentially all of the text that might appear or any infographics, appear within that inner square. So if I switch back to my title here, you can see everything appears within that inner square. So just sticking with this title for the time being, so this is the lower third that I created. Because it's Photoshop, it means I can be a little bit more creative, or it's a little bit more straightforward than using Premiere Pro's titling tool. And I've just saved that as Photoshop title. If I move over to Premiere Pro, you can see simple setup. Here's my generic video in the background. And all I need to do now is just import. So I can have a look through my content here. And in my folder, I've got my Photoshop title. So it's the file that I created. Click Open to open that up, and I get this dialog window. So if I switch back to Photoshop, you can see I've got 4 layers of content here, my white box, yellow box, and then 2 layers of text. Back in Premiere Pro, it's now saying, do you want me to create a graphic from this that merges all of those layers together? So we'll do it this way first, and then we'll explore the other options that are available in here. So I'm going to click OK. You see the title drops in, and then if I click and drag that like any other clip, you'll see it plays over the top. And you can see now where that checkerboard pattern was is the see-through part of the clip. That plays quite nicely. So the nice thing about using this route to create our titles is that we can take advantage of what Adobe call a round-trip editing facility, which means that you can edit content from one application to another application, and it retains a connection. So with my Photoshop title open here, if I right click, you'll notice I can do Edit Original or Edit in Adobe Photoshop. And if I check the Edit in Adobe Photoshop, it flips back to Photoshop. And if the file wasn't open, it would open the file, and then I can edit that to another lower third. Click Save, and then if I switch back to Premiere, you can see that's changed. So we now got another lower third. So I can keep going back to Photoshop, back to Premiere Pro, and make any changes to the title that I want. The second thing that I can do is import things slightly differently. So if I go to import the title again, This time, instead of merge all layers, which mashes all the layers down, I'm going to select merged layers. And now I can select which parts of that Photoshop file come in. So I'm going to turn the text off here for a reason you'll see in a moment. So now all I'm going to pull in is my yellow box and my white box. So I'm going to click OK. And you can see now if I drop that on the clip that I've only got the yellow box and the white box. And the reason that I did that was now I can use the traditional titling tool to add a little bit of text over the top. So I can use a combination of Photoshop to give me a little bit more control over the graphics and the look and feel, and use some of the more complex editing features that you'll get in Photoshop, but then use the standard title tool in Premiere to do what it does really well, which is generate text. So you can see I'm breaking down my content into layers here. I've got the graphic in the background and then the text on top. And again, the nice thing about that is that if I decide halfway through the show that I want to change the colour of the graphics, so for example, I don't want my yellow box to be yellow, I want my yellow box to be green. If I save that and then switch back to Premiere, you can see now all of my title, anything that uses that Photoshop will have the green box underneath, but I don't need to worry about the text on top. So I can use this as my kind of graphic base and then go underneath. So it's not impossible, particularly with a simple graphic like this one, to create this using the graphics tools within Premiere Pro. But as I say, using Photoshop just gives you access to all of these extra editing tools and filters, and Photoshop might be something you're really comfortable with and creative with. One last thing to point out in using Photoshop and Premiere Pro together is that I don't need to start with Photoshop. I can start with, if I go to File and New, Photoshop file, 1920 by 1080. It essentially matches the sequence. Then click OK. It asks me to save it somewhere. Click Save. And then it will fire me back to Photoshop with a screen, with a new file that's exactly the right shape and size to work with the sequence that I've got set here. Because most of the footage we'll be working with is 1080 high definition footage, I don't need to worry about it. But if I was working, let's say for example in a slightly different resolution, I'd shot on DV, or I was working in a slightly different sequence size, so let's say I was editing for square video rather than for standard HD video, then creating a Photoshop file from the sequence using the File and New Photoshop file might be an easier way to make sure that your graphics are always the right size.